Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Frank Griffel to discuss the great 11th to 12th century Islamic jurist, theologian, polymath, and mystic, Al-Ghazali. We will discuss both the historical context of Al-Ghazali's life, his contributions and famous disputations with the philosophers of his own time, as well as his lasting impact on us today. After studying philosophy, Arabic literature, and Islamic studies at the universities in Germany, Damascus, Berlin, and London, Dr. Griffel received his PhD in 1999 from the Freie Universität in Berlin, Germany. In his thesis, he wrote about the development of the judgment of apostasy in classical Islam. Afterwards, Dr. Griffel worked as a research fellow at the Orient Institute of the German Oriental Society in Beirut, Lebanon. In 2000, Dr. Griffel came to Yale, where he teaches courses on intellectual history of Islam, its theology and philosophy, both classical and modern, and the way Islamic thinkers react to Western modernity. In 2021, Dr. Griffel published The Formation of Post-Classical Philosophy in Islam, which dealt with the profound changes the Islamic discourse on philosophy underwent as a result of al-Ghazali's Tahafut, al-falasifa. Dr. Griffel, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I figured we might just dive right into the subject matter. Who is Al-Ghazali? What can you tell us about Al-Ghazali and his life and his accomplishments? What can you tell us about him?
Right. So Al-Ghazali was a Muslim thinker. And when we use the word thinker, we try to avoid the distinction between philosopher and theologian. He was both, who lived at the turn from the 11th to the 12th century. He was born, we don't know precisely when, around the year 1056 in the city of Tabarantus, which today no longer exists and is in a region that today is northeast Iran, known as Khorasan then, a country by itself, as I say, that today appears in maps only as names of provinces of Iran. Who grew up there, was well connected, was lucky in his education, rose to a very prominent teaching position in Baghdad, the city of the capital city of the Seljuk Empire, and also the Muslim Caliphate, the Islamic Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate. Then, as he writes in his autobiography, very abruptly quit this very prominent teaching position and became something like an itinerant scholar who was still teaching, though no longer teaching at state-sponsored institutions. Then for a second time, at the beginning of a new Muslim century, which was at the year 1105, that's the beginning of the 6th century in the Muslim calendar, started a second teaching career at a state-sponsored institution in Khorasan again. This is where he grew up. And then he died in 1111. And in the meantime, he wrote a staggering number of works and became hugely influential, and is today one of the important reference points of both Muslim theology and Islamic philosophy.
I know you mentioned a bit about his autobiography. Did he write us in an autobiography for us to read? Or I remember reading something, isn't it called like The Deliverance from Error? Is sort of the way he titles it? Or
so one of the reasons why the life of Al-Ghazali is so fascinating and why he is also so teachable is that he wrote this great autobiography. The Arabic title is Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, which translates as The Deliverer from Error. So the book itself is considered the thing that delivers the reader from error. And there he presents, on the one hand, details about his own life, but I could say more importantly, something like an ideal development of an intellectual during his time who goes through several phases in his development. It's like almost the German tradition of a Bildungsroman that he writes about himself, starting initially with the development of doubts, the raising of doubts within his own self, which prompts him to investigate what is knowledge, what is certain knowledge, goes right into questions of what we would today call epistemology. And then he talks about 4 different intellectual traditions that were prominent during his days, and kind of presents to us the idea that he tried out all of them, and at the end he settles with one particular intellectual tradition, that is Muslim Sufism, and writes a little bit more about why this particular movement is or delivered him. That's clear, because, and one should say, and this is important here, one of the 4 traditions that he tries out is the tradition of Aristotelian, or one could say Greek philosophy in Islam, and another one is traditional Muslim theology of the school where he was educated in. So there is certainly some, you would say, autobiographical truth in it, in the sense that there are some details which he certainly lived through. On the other hand, it's very formulaic, and there's also doubts about whether he really experienced all the things that he writes about it, but it's definitely an immensely entertaining and immensely fascinating book.
I've heard it compared sometimes to Augustine's Confessions, where it is seen as an autobiography, but it also has a particular audience and particular aim in writing.
Yeah, that's a fair comparison on those accounts, but the differences are still quite significant.
Sure. So I figured we might also dive right into one of al-Ghazali's famous works, the Tahafut, al-falasifa, which we referenced earlier. What is this work? What was the work's audience? What's the primary aim of the work?
Right. So when I talked about al-Ghazali's life, one thing is a bit inexplicable, namely that he comes from, indeed, from a humble background, however, probably well connected. So his family didn't have a high status, but there was scholarship in that region which became very important and which was pushed by the political powers of the day, which were basically the Seljuks, a Turkish dynasty with immense military power that had just established itself 50 years before al-Ghazali had these kinds of successes. And they now supported, the Seljuks were strong supporters of Sunni Islam, which sounds for us something like, of course, that's what Muslims do. But in those days, that was a pretty new development. Earlier powers had sometimes openly supported Shiite Islam. And these were the first who really created educational institutions that promoted Sunni scholarship. And al-Ghazali belonged to a theological group that kind of provided precisely what was needed by the Seljuks, namely a rationalist theology that could respond to the challenges of the day. And the challenges of the day were, for al-Ghazali, twofold. On the one hand, there was the challenge of Shiite theology, which in those days was Seventh Shiite theology, not exactly the same kind of Shiism that is, for instance, today dominant in such countries as Iran. But this was the Shiism of the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, which was dominated or heavily influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. And the second tradition that was important was an Iranian tradition of, and written in Arabic. It happened in Iran, but it was an Arabic language tradition that engages with Greek philosophy, Works of Greek philosophy were translated into Arabic in the 8th and the 9th century. And by the 10th century, there is a thriving movement of philosophers who write in Arabic, who engage with the text, particularly of Aristotle, but also with Aristotle's late antique commentators. And those late antique commentators are very often highly influenced also by Neoplatonism. So that's what we call the movement of falsafa. Engages, of course, falsafa comes from the Greek word philosophia, and it engages with Greek philosophy, develops itself its own method, develops certain teachings, and the most important figure here is the philosopher Ibn Sina in Arabic, who will later be translated into Latin and will become known in the West as Avicenna. He lived, roughly speaking, about a century earlier than Al-Ghazali, strictly speaking, 80 years earlier. Not yet under the Seljuk rulership. He had probably Shiite sympathies, but those things are not important because he really developed a philosophical system by itself that is its own interpretation of Islam, and becomes heavily influential. He becomes heavily influential during the, let's say, 50 years after his death. And by the time Al-Ghazali studies, Avicenna is a household name in academic circles, and a challenge to Sunni Islam on various accounts. Particular ideas about the power of God, the freedom of God, similar things about ethics, about human actions, and many, and this is how Al-Ghazali actually portrays it, and here I refer to the first pages of his book, Tahafut al-falasifa, where he says that, you know, there are people in our community now who are so much drawn to the teachings of the falasifa that they think they no longer need to fulfill the ritual duties of Islam, meaning they no longer need to pray, they no longer need to fast in Ramadan, they no longer need to do the things that are prescribed in our religion, because they think they're smarter than we. And therefore, those ritual duties are not for them. They are only for the ordinary people. So what Al-Ghazali here refers to is a particular element of the teaching of Avicenna, and with him, one could say, all the movement of falsafa. And that was, one might say, what triggered his ire. But we should say a little bit more about the book itself, Tahafut al-falasifa. So Al-Ghazali comes from a relatively humble background, but then has a staggering career. And one of the explanations for this is particularly this book, where he deals with falsafa in a way like never has done before. The political authorities, and here I mean particular the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire, whose name was Nizam al-Mulk, who was himself a Muslim theologian, educated in theology and educated in Islamic law, and was really the one might say, you know, the architect of the religious policy of the Seljuk Empire. He was very interested in, first of all, a theological response to the Fatimid Shiites, the Seventh Shiites, but then also to a theological response to the movement of falsafa. And Al-Ghazali could provide both. And that's, I believe, what gave him this appointment at the so-called Nizamiya Madrasa, named after Nizam al-Mulk, that was founded in Baghdad around, I think it was 1160, something like 65. Sorry, 1065. And Al-Ghazali becomes there the head teacher in the year 1092. And he remains for 3 years the most important intellectual there, and one could say the most important intellectual in Baghdad. And he writes in his autobiography that during these 3 years, he wrote the book Tahafut al-falasifa, which I think isn't entirely true. I'm pretty sure he had significant, if not drafts, significant work done before. It's a very intelligent book. It's very influential for the whole history of Western philosophy. It's roughly speaking the first time that the tradition of Aristotelian philosophy is attacked in a very fundamental way. That hasn't happened before. There are, of course, there's always been criticism on Aristotelianism. One could say, quote, for instance, refer to John Philoponus and other Christian thinkers who have kind of tried to poke holes into the philosophical edifice of Aristotelianism. But nobody tried to pull the rug under Aristotelianism the way Al-Ghazali actually did. Although we should also say that whereas his criticism sounds very radical, at the end of the day, it isn't really. There were a number of things that Al-Ghazali wasn't happy with that he points out in his, as he calls it, refutation of Aristotelian philosophy, the Tahafut al-falasifa. But there are also a number of things that he accepted as true, in opposition to his own theological school, which wasn't well informed about the tradition of Greek philosophy in Arabic, and therefore rejected it outright. And Al-Ghazali criticizes this attitude. He says, there's no use in this. You have to look into the different elements that is taught by falsafa and by the falasifa, the practitioners of falsafa, and you have to decide case by case. And you should never, he actually points this out in various of his writings, it's most prominently in his autobiography, you should never reject a teaching by virtue of the person who teaches it. But you should always look at the teaching itself and then decide whether, based on that, whether the person who teaches it or not is a good teacher. And those are traditions that existed. These intellectual traditions existed in Islam, and he quotes here a saying of Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, that is very prominent in his writings. And he also says that, and this is another quote from the introduction of his Tahafut, that if somebody rejects a teaching of the philosophers that they can successfully demonstrate, and he gives the example of the explanation for a lunar eclipse, where, of course, there were several speculations about what is actually happening, and he refers to clear proofs that this is an alignment of the sun, the moon, and the earth. And if you reject that, then you make yourself ridiculous in the eyes of those people who understand what is going on, because this is geometry, and geometry is a field where demonstrative science is successful. It's possible and successful. And I should probably explain that in a second, what demonstrative science is. And maybe I should do that. This is at the heart of one might say the philosophical edifice of Aristotelianism, the way it was understood by the Arabs. A 10th century Muslim philosopher, Al-Farabi, famously claims that earlier Aristotelians, both of the Greek tradition and of the Arabic traditions, hadn't fully understood what Aristotelian science is about. And he says, Aristotelian science is about demonstration. Demonstration means that one applies in one's argument a certain structure, syllogistic structure. Aristotle actually did study this in his textbook of logic, which we refer to as the Organon, which consists of 9 different parts. And he says, there are certain ways of how to combine two premises with quantifications, that will always lead to true conclusions. There are 14 of those patterns. And if you put, and this is the claim here, if you put true premises into these 14 patterns, then you will, without doubt, you will reach to conclusions that are equally true as the premises. So what this offers to Al-Farabi is a kind of blueprint for what science is really about. You need to start with premises that are true in a way that they cannot be doubted. So we would call these axioms, things that we all agree upon, that you really cannot doubt. Such an example would, for instance, be the whole is greater than its parts. Other things, for instance, in geometry or in mathematics, in this case, 1 and 1 is 2. If you start doubting that, in this case, then you will never reach it, any science. That's the claim here. Now, once you have those, you can put those premises into these syllogistic structure, and you will reach to new conclusions that will then lead you further in the development of knowledge. And that is what science is all about. Now, Al-Ghazali basically, and this is the important thing, he accepts the claim, the Aristotelian claim of demonstrative science. You could basically say, and this is probably a too simplified statement, but the history of Western philosophy can be characterized as a more and more skeptical approach towards the possibility of demonstrative science. Generally speaking, today we think demonstrative science is only possible in mathematics, in no other science. But Aristotelian science overall thought that one could actually establish similar systems of thought, like mathematics today, even in such things as theology. So that one could even prove, without doubt, the existence of God. And one could not only prove the existence of God, one could also demonstrate, meaning show without room for doubt, that God has certain attributes. For instance, that he's totally one. Another claim is that he creates this world from eternity, that there is no beginning of creation. And those things, philosophers such as Al-Farabi and also Ibn Sina said can be demonstrated. And that's, of course, a very strong challenge towards Islamic theology, which, for instance, teaches that that creation begins at one moment in time and that God has a free will to do whatever he wants to. And both these teachings are denied by the philosophy of Al-Farabi and Avicenna, who claim not that this is their opinion, of course it's their opinion, but they also say it must be the opinion of every intelligent person who is able to understand what demonstrative science is. So meaning everybody who understands Aristotelianism, everybody who understands philosophy will come to the same conclusion, namely that God doesn't have a free will and acts out of a necessity, and that there is no creation in time, but the world exists from eternity. What Al-Ghazali does in his book, Tahafut al-falasifa, which is often translated as the incoherence of the philosophers, is he doubts that such demonstrations are possible in the field that the philosophers call metaphysics, which reaches into proving God's existence, proving attributes of God. Then he basically says, no, these arguments are not demonstrative. And he goes into details and he goes into very small matters sometimes and shows where the argumentative mistakes are that the philosophers make. And it's very simple. I pointed out that he has actually put his task very simple. The only thing he needs to do is he needs to raise doubts about these teachings. So in a sense that the book Tahafut al-falasifa is more or less sometimes characterized as a book in this case where he throws stuff at a wall and sees what sticks. And if one thing sticks, that's enough to show that these arguments are truly not demonstrative. So very often it's about possibility. The philosophers claim these arguments are necessary, and there cannot be any other conclusion. If Al-Ghazali shows that, well, there is a possibility for another conclusion, and there is a possibility to hold another opinion about this subject, which is just as reasonable as what the philosophers do, or the philosopher do, then he has already accomplished his task. And that's one might say, the beauty of the book, that it plays around a lot with possibilities. Very often there is the moment where Al-Ghazali says, what would you say if I put forward this argument? And for the reader, then he said, well, that's equally convincing. And that's it. The moment it's equally convincing, that's all Al-Ghazali wants to do. He wants to show that the teachings that Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina put up in the field of metaphysics, meaning also including the field of theology, their ideas about God, their ideas about God's attributes, are simply speculation. And here comes the important thing, and they cannot hold water, or they cannot stand against the authority of revelation.
It's very interesting what you said, that the work itself is very much Al-Ghazali's criticisms about how the inability to demonstrate certain truths in the field of metaphysics. Because Al-Ghazali, as I understand it, is perfectly happy to concede certain points that the philosophers conclude. He just doesn't think that the arguments prove them. Would you say that that's fair?
Right. So, let me be clear about this. So Al-Ghazali accepts demonstrative science in mathematics, and he also accepts demonstrative science in many natural sciences, and he also concedes that much of the teachings that the philosophers actually present in the natural sciences are convincing. That's particularly true in one field, which will become later in his life very important, namely what we call philosophical psychology. So the teachings about the soul. That will become very important later in Al-Ghazali's life, partly because it's turned towards Sufism. If one reads closely his works, which we've done, many of my colleagues and me have done in the past 20, 30 years, then one comes to the clear conclusion that in such fields, whenever he talks about the soul, whenever he talks about the faculties of the soul, what we can do with the soul and why the soul is important, he actually works within the parameters of Avicennan philosophy, meaning within the parameters of Ibn Sina's philosophy. He adapts this very, very clearly. The one field where he objects, this is clear from his Tahafut al-falasifa, is metaphysics. Anything that has to do with the teachings about God, where he basically says, here the philosophers are unable to provide demonstrations, meaning what they do is do the same thing as what Muslim theologians do. They try to give reasonable explanations for things that are very hard to understand. One thing is, for instance, the movement of the stars, where, of course, we all know there was a very important and very popular pre-15th century model, that is the Ptolemaic geocentrical model, where Al-Ghazali actually points out, it's a hypothesis. Whereas the philosophers say, this is proven, we can prove this. He says, what we have, these are my words paraphrasing Al-Ghazali, what we have are dots on the sky that move. Now, if you tell me that behind these dots are spheres on circles and epicircles, that can you actually mathematically predetermine what will happen in the future and all this, then I say spheres are not visible, spheres cannot be seen. As I say, what we see are moving dots. And so he actually says this is a pretty harsh criticism towards the underlying ideas here. Not so much that he wouldn't say it's not successful. Mathematical astronomy is successful according to Al-Ghazali. You can predict such things as lunar eclipses and solar eclipses. But what really is going on there, he says, is in real terms not known to us, which is a very, very important epistemological criticism of the science of his days, where he points out the limitations. Of course, we know that the geocentrical model doesn't at least concur with how we think of the universe today. So we might actually say he clearly has a point. But for many of his contemporaries, this looked a little bit weird. And because on the one hand, Al-Ghazali criticizes the basis of philosophy during his time without necessarily debating about its results. So for instance, he says, one of the things that Ibn Sina actually teaches is that God is pure unity. And Al-Ghazali has no beef with that. I mean, he actually says, sure, I also believe that God is pure unity. That's what Tawheed, this is one of the central tenets of Islam, monotheism is about. But he says the way you actually prove it is not right, because you prove something in a way, in this case, that is not that is different from the Muslim revelation. That's one dispute. The other dispute he actually has, and this also comes up in the Tahafut al-falasifa, is about the origins of the philosophical sciences. And here is an interesting connection to his Sufism. So, for instance, he says, okay, so this model about the stars and the celestial spheres, which he takes as one example, how do we know about this? And he looks at the philosophical movement. The philosophical says, oh, we know this through mathematical proof. We know this through demonstration. And Al-Ghazali says, well, okay, now that we kind of have a model, we can work with mathematics, klar. But how do we get to this model? How did humanity get to this model? And there he makes the claim that such models as these were actually given to very early scientists who were, on the one hand, scientists, but on the other hand, were also prophets. So they have received this kind of model as a revelation. Of course, Islam teaches that there have been numerous, uncounted prophets before Muhammad. And these prophets, and names are thrown around, like, for instance, Hermes Trismegistos and others. These figures were known in the Greek, in the Muslim tradition, the Greek tradition, the Muslim tradition, and they count for Al-Ghazali as the founders of such sciences as medicine, such sciences as astronomy, such sciences even as mathematics. Although he didn't write about it in this way, but he would say Pythagoras, for him, is of course an early Greek sage, but he's also an early prophet. And if he found out about the law about triangles, then not by any kind of, let's say, demonstration, but because he was given that law in a revelation through insight. So that's the claim that he makes. And he also says in this piece, those people don't need necessarily to be prophets. But we have in Islam something similar. There's a group of people that are in Sufism are referred to as the awliya. These are called, the friends of God, or intimates, God's intimates, better translation here, people who are close to God. And even now, he says, even now in our societies, these people exist and they receive inspiration from a divine source. And it is this inspiration that pushes forward the sciences. So he has a different view in this case about how progress in the sciences is made. And one could probably, although he wasn't very clear about this and didn't write much about it, one could probably assume in this case that when he thought that any kind of progress in the sciences is made, that then some kind of divine inspiration is behind it. And this is also how he viewed himself. He viewed himself as someone who received a significant dose of that inspiration in the writings of, for instance, the book Tahafut al-falasifa.
I see. And then if I may ask, how many of al-Ghazali's criticisms of the philosopher are based upon claims of falsehood or heresy? Because we've been talking a lot about how al-Ghazali criticizes the philosophers for not demonstrating what they hold as demonstrations, but he's also concerned about certain claims that they make, like the eternity of the world or God's knowledge regarding particular things. Is that correct?
Right. Thus far, we've only spoken about truth or falsehood. But this is why al-Ghazali counts as a philosopher. Because the book Tahafut al-falasifa is first of all about truth or falsehood, which is why it is really a philosophical book that comes in a theological garb. Because what he wants to do is he wants to create, or he has a very skeptical approach towards the philosophical teachings of his day. He attacks them in order to create, one say, epistemological room for the claims of revelation. So so there is behind it is certainly a theological goal, but the means are extremely clearly philosophical. Now, but then at the very end of the book, at the very last page, he does something very interesting. I mean, I'm also saying this is for many readers today shocking. Namely, that then he puts on the head as of a Muslim legal authority, which he also was. He was a great theologian, he was a great philosopher, but he was also a great legal authority in Islam. And he writes what is known as a fatwa. So puts to himself a question, and the question basically goes like this: now that you've discussed the teaching of these people and found so many errors in them, can you tell us which of these errors are of a kind that they cannot be tolerated in Islam? And he uses a certain legal tool, the legal tool of apostasy, which he refers to as unbelief. And apostasy from Islam is actually something that is, under certain circumstances, punishable even by death. And he refers to that in this, on the last page of the Tahafut al-falasifa, and says, if any Muslim, and later on he qualifies any well-educated Muslim who teaches this, not just ordinary people, but an intellectual, a Muslim intellectual, goes about and teaches that the world is eternal and was not created in time, first thing. Second thing, that God does not know individuals, but only knows classes of beings. And thirdly, that there is no bodily resurrection in the afterlife. If any Muslim intellectual teaches one of these things, then he is no longer a Muslim, but is, according to al-Ghazali, an apostate from Islam and can be punished, in fact, can be killed. So what al-Ghazali tries to do here is he tries to persecute the movement of falsafa. He tries to do something that we know happened, and this is why this also has its own career in Western scholarship, happened quite often in the Western tradition, when a church authority said, you do this, and from this moment on, you can basically be killed at the stake. In Islam, those things were very, very highly unusual. And one should also say that in my most recent work, I tried to show that al-Ghazali's fatwa was not successful. It was not something that really caught. Whereas earlier scholars in my tradition, in Islamic studies, Western Islamic studies, have very often portrayed this fatwa as the law of the land in Islam, so that nobody could put forward any of these positions. It's actually far from it. We actually have a philosophical tradition that carries on for many, many centuries, where these questions are very openly debated, and where numerous philosophers go about and write very openly that they still believe, that creation without beginning in time can be proven demonstratively. So those things actually, so meaning al-Ghazali tries to excommunicate the movement of falsafa, the philosopher. May have also been successful during his time, maybe for a couple of decades, but overall, this is something that is unsuccessful in Islam, and we see a continued history of philosophy after Al-Ghazali.
Right, right. Okay, I wanted to ask one more question concerning the Tahafut, and then I figured maybe we could go on to some other topics. But I wanted to ask, how does Al-Ghazali in the Tahafut understand the role of causality and God's relationship to creation? I know this is a bit of a hot topic in Al-Ghazali studies, but
Right.
Does Al-Ghazali think that there could theoretically be like secondary causes or movers in addition to the primary cause of God, or how does he understand that?
No, this is a very good illustration of how he actually dealt with the teachings of the philosopher. So Al-Ghazali himself comes from a theological tradition which we call Asharite theology, which was founded by a very important Muslim theologian who lived at the turn to the 10th century, al-Ashari. He lived in Basra and in Baghdad. He lived in Iraq, and Al-Ghazali was educated in this tradition, and al-Ashari actually teaches a very interesting cosmological model, which we call occasionalism, which I have to characterize very quickly, but it's fascinating. It basically means that each and every event in this world is immediately caused by God. So whenever you see anything happen in this world, like my voice now coming out of your computer, then al-Ashari, even if he was unfamiliar with all this technology, would definitely say, there's no computer doing anything here. It is a sound that is immediately produced by God in the particular room that you're sitting. And there is nothing other than God's immediate activity that creates these things. And that's true for a ball rolling over a field, and that's true for each and every event. And one could think of it more, and this is how I try to illustrate this when I talk about it with my students, as a little bit like, you know, there's a moment in time where God creates everything, and after it follows a next moment in time where God also creates everything, and then follows the next. So it's a little bit like we have, you know, like you watch a movie, you have different frames there, and all of them together, they actually create a development. But it really, he actually, al-Ashari believed there in what we call an atomism of time, so that there are these moments, and everything itself, each individual thing is created by God and arranged by God. And in the next moment, he does the same thing. And if the arrangement is different in the second moment of the two from the first, then of course we see a development, we see movement. So that's extremely fascinating. One has to wrap one's mind around it. And one of the implications is that there is no causality amongst any of God's creations. As I said, no computer creates, not I create my voice. It doesn't go through the technological process of the internet. It is in the room because God wants it to be in the room. Now, Al-Ghazali initially, he writes about this a lot, and he defends this model on various of his publications. But he also, inspired by his close contact with the teachings of the philosopher, finds out about a different model, the Aristotelian model, which is very similar to how we think about it today. Namely, in this case, that, you know, there are things that create something, but with a very clear difference that all the things that create something in this world are themselves the creations of earlier creations going back. You can trace causal chains. All causal chains go back to God, to the first principle. Either go back, if you actually look from this perspective, or you start from God's perspective and say, they all start with God. Everything in this world starts with God's creation, which is not considered, in this case, a temporal beginning, but it's an ontological beginning, meaning God in this case has, basically has all the power that there is, comes from God, and God basically gives it to other people. That's what we call secondary causality. All the things that have power are intermediaries insofar as they pass over God's power, creative power, to the things that they themselves create. And Al-Ghazali looks at this and says, in this case, if I look at these two models, and he makes a couple of modifications on the philosophical model. Of course, he takes out the eternity of the world and several other things. If I look at these two models, then I'm unable to say which one applies to the world. Because there is simply no moment, which could show us that either the occasionalist model applies or the secondary causality model of the philosopher applies. And this is a very good illustration, because what Al-Ghazali is really interested in is an epistemological critique. He says he really wants to know in this case, how do we know stuff? And if we are in an impasse, and he says we cannot know how God relates to this world, how God creates. Does God create through the model of occasionalism through the world, which gives him full freedom to do whatever he wants to? Or does he create, first of all, a first intellect, then a first sphere, then all the celestial other spheres, and at the end of the day, and this is a temporal model which does not apply here in this case, and then he creates, the so-called sublunar sphere where the world, where the earth is that actually the model of creation? And Al-Ghazali says, I do not know. I mean, he doesn't, this is interesting also, he doesn't say this openly. This is something that I tried to prove in one of my books, that he actually holds this position, that he is agnostic about the cosmological details of this world, and hence loses interest in the question. And interestingly enough, writes books where he subscribes, certain books where he subscribes to an Asharite occasionalist model, and he writes other books where he very, very clearly subscribes to a philosophical model of secondary causality, which also makes it, him a fascinating thinker, who is kind of, has a skepticism and also, want to say, a distance towards truth that in the Western tradition, we don't find that often.
Very interesting. Okay, so I figured maybe we could shift the topic a little bit to discussing Al-Ghazali on questions of authority and interpretation. We recently had Dr. Peter Adamson on where we discussed this a little bit, but I figured we'd particularly focus on Al-Ghazali's his understanding of hermeneutic criteria for reading religious texts. Because as I understand it, Al-Ghazali is also famous for outlining criteria for reading religious texts such as the Quran, and he wrote a work called I don't remember what the Arabic translation is, but I think it's the decisive criterion for distinguishing Islam from a type of belief. Yes. Or apostasy. What are the criterion that
right? Yes. So the book that you are referring to in Arabic, the title is Faisal al-Tafriqa Bayna al-Islam wa al-Zandaqa, and a good English translation would be the decisive criterion in distinguishing Islam from Zandaqa. Is a legal term, means clandestine unbelief. And what clandestine unbelief means is what I pointed out before, namely that you hold a position that Al-Ghazali considers as no longer more being part of Islam. So in a sense, the book actually outlines what is the border between Islam and what is no longer covered by Islam. That's one thing he's interested in. So in a sense, this book actually comes out of the last page of his Tahafut al-falasifa. And once more is explain what he's doing there. There's some legal explanation there. But then he also does something other, which is very interesting. And which is a question that each and every, let's say, rationalist, intellectual who is part of a monotheist tradition that accepts prophecy is concerned with, namely, what do we do in the moment that the text of Revelation clearly violates something that is established through reasonable arguments. And Al-Ghazali here coins a phrase that is, he calls it the rule of interpretation. And first of all, this is so far nothing new in the sense that what do we do in those moments where we see that revelation, and revelation means on the one hand the Quran, but it also refers to here the corpus of sayings that are transmitted from the Prophet Muhammad, the so-called Hadith corpus. So what if there is something either in the Quran or in the Hadith corpus that clearly violates reason? And one example would be that the Quran on various occasions talks about a hand of God. Now, Al-Ghazali is of the opinion that he can actually demonstrate through demonstrative arguments of the kind that Aristotle describes, that God is not spatial, that God has no direction, and that certainly God doesn't have a body. Now, hand of God, therefore, is not a hand in the sense that we have a hand. So what he does is he allegorically interprets it. He interprets it as a certain power to give or to take, certain power to punish. So that's a very prominent example. Another problematic passage in the Quran is on various occasions, the Quran actually says that God sits upright on a throne. Again, Al-Ghazali is of the opinion that there are demonstrative arguments that God cannot sit on a throne. So he must interpret it figuratively. And that's what he does in the Faisal. He explains in this case, and everybody, he claims, every Muslim intellectual, every Muslim thinker, every Muslim theologian, at one point has to engage in figurative interpretation. No matter how literally you want to actually read the Quran. Fully literal reading, Al-Ghazali says, is impossible. But we dispute about which passages of the Quran should be interpreted figuratively and which should be read literally. And there were, of course, even during Al-Ghazali's time and even later, where people who said, no, God has a hand. He has a physical hand. And they would say, and this we know from Revelation, and you cannot disprove that. And Al-Ghazali says, yes, I can. And his rule of interpretation goes precisely like this, I would say. The moment you are actually able to produce a demonstrative argument, according to the philosophical rules, according to the rules of Aristotle's organon, the moment you are successfully able to produce a demonstrative argument that the literal text of the Quran is impossible, such as God has a hand, in that moment you are allowed to engage in figurative interpretation. So he gives this tool, this philosophical tool of the demonstrative argument, which he has viewed initially very critical, and this is from later in his life, later a very important role in developing what are the true teachings of Islam. And he claims that whatever can be demonstratively proven, meaning whatever is accepted by science, must be part of the teaching of Islam. And that becomes later on a very, very powerful method and a very powerful position, which Muslim thinkers take, for instance, also later in the confrontation with Christianity, that they actually think there's nothing in Islam that ever violates reason. And if science has proved this or that, if science, for instance, has proven Darwin's theory of evolution, then nothing in Islam speaks against it, and we find it easy to integrate it into Islamic teachings.
That very much reminds me of certain scholastic theologians that sort of reiterate a similar line, like Thomas Aquinas in his understanding of theology and metaphysics, because they're going to read a lot of biblical passages that talk about physical parts of God in these metaphorical readings. Right. Does Al-Ghazali, if I can then further ask, does Al-Ghazali have a particular audience that he's responding to when he's arguing for this methodological approach? Like, are there jurists or philosophers?
Right. These are the theologians of his own school. And that's also where it becomes very influential.
All right. Well, then I figured maybe we could then turn to another topic. How exactly was Al-Ghazali received during his day and then after his death? Was he universally received? Were there any controversies regarding his arguments or critiques of Aristotle? What can you tell us about the aftermath?
Wow, that's a interesting question. Also, very complex question. Yes, there were conflicts during his days. There were disputes during his days. He had lots of enemies in his own theological school. Also amongst the philosopher, of course, there was initially an outright rejection. But generally speaking, one might actually say the history of philosophy has basically come around his position that metaphysics is not a field of demonstrative science. And that happened very quickly. Within probably 100 years or so, this is a position that is almost unanimously adapted by at least most Muslim thinkers, even those in this case who see themselves in the tradition of philosophy, that they would say, Avicenna is pretty convincing in many of his teachings, but demonstrative in metaphysics he ain't. And that's, generally speaking, I would say, almost say a revolution in the history of Western philosophy, which plays a very important role in Islam, in Judaism, and also in Christianity. So this type of position was, for instance, clearly adopted by Maimonides. And from there, and from the translation of lots of other works, it actually goes into the Western tradition as well. Takes a little bit longer, even in the Latin tradition. But generally speaking, this is also part, one might say, of then ideas in the Renaissance about epistemology that generally criticize the notion of demonstration, being the yardstick of knowledge, for instance, in metaphysics. But the kind of influence that Al-Ghazali has is most often indirect. So Al-Ghazali was only one of his works was translated from Arabic into Latin, and that is particularly not a work where he put down his own ideas. But there were lots of works that were highly influenced by Al-Ghazali that were readily available in Latin and played a role, and one would probably say in the Renaissance even more than in the medieval period. So one of it is, for instance, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed is a work that is very skeptical. So generally speaking, what Al-Ghazali infuses into the history of philosophy is this idea of methodological skepticism. So where you really try to poke holes into arguments and say this argument doesn't work. And in the Muslim tradition, this has led then to, I would say, a very thorough engagement with arguments, very technical engagement with arguments that is quite often unreadable for modern readers because the discussions become so technical, but led to a long tradition of very sophisticated philosophical engagement with lots of subjects and highly interesting books that were written. So for me, Al-Ghazali is a turning point in the history of Western philosophy, together with Avicenna, and has a very, very long-lasting influence that I sometimes draw, in this case, from Al-Ghazali way up to Immanuel Kant and others.
Very interesting. As I also understand it, however, there was kind of a response made by certain Islamic philosophers arguing against particularly Al-Ghazali's work, Tahafut, al-falasifa. And as I understand it, there was one work that was written called the Tahafut al-Tahafut, and which I always thought was a kind of an interesting title to title a work, but it's a response saying, I think that your work is incoherent, or it doesn't work, or
right. Yeah, first of all, very quickly, I should say that incoherence is one translation of the word tahafut, an English translation. I've actually moved away a little bit from that. I find a better translation is the English word precipitance, which means you rush into something without good preparation and without being able to accomplish what one has to. So one might say, sloppiness, more or less. The sloppiness of the philosophers is, in my opinion, a better translation of the word tahafut. Yes, and you're right. Averroes, who is, interestingly, a very conservative philosopher, in the sense that even after Al-Ghazali's critique of apostasis, of demonstrative science, he maintains that it is possible. He's very faithful Aristotelian, committed to the teachings of the Organon, and says, no, Al-Farabi was right when he said metaphysics can be done demonstratively. And if Avicenna didn't truly do it demonstratively, then it's not his fault, but it can be done demonstratively. Let me show you how. That's more or less the work of Averroes. And he does it by commentating the works of Aristotle in great detail. And he shows how arguments that Aristotle makes are either demonstrative, or if they themselves are not demonstrative, can be made in a way that they are demonstrative. So he is he really goes back, he tries to draw back the wheel of criticism from Al-Ghazali. And in his response to Al-Ghazali's Tahafut, which he calls Tahafut al-Tahafut, the sloppiness of the sloppiness, which is really, his approach there. He says in this case, but first of all, you didn't fully understand what the philosophers were teaching there. And since you weren't fully educated in this field, there's no wonder that you are not fully understanding. There's also no wonder in this case that you see the clarity of the argument and you just muddle around. That's Averroes' claim. It should, however, be said that whereas, and this is why I mean that in the West, in the Latin tradition, it took a little bit longer. Whereas Averroes has a strong influence through the translation of his works in the Latin tradition, his influence on the Islamic tradition is limited. And in the Islamic tradition, most philosophers really accept Al-Ghazali's criticism of metaphysics is not demonstrative. And so also in much of the Jewish tradition, particularly those in this case who follow Maimonides, whereas in the Latin tradition, people follow then more Averroes in the claim that, maybe metaphysics can actually be done in a demonstrative way. So yes, this is one. It should, however, also be said that I would say 50, 80 years ago, Tahafut, the sloppiness, or the precipitance of the precipitance, or the incoherence of the incoherence, however one wants to translate it, was regarded as a major philosophical work where, philosophy was defended against the claims of religion. So there was also, I would say, a very westernized view of this conflict. Nowadays, the majority of the field where I'm working on see it very differently. We do not regard Averroes' book as a particular clear one, as a particular also influential one, and probably even not as a particularly philosophically successful one. So if we look at these two, whereas, as I said, 50, 80 years, many people would say, Averroes defended philosophy against religion. today we look at it in a very different way and say, you know, the genius work, at least the way I see it, the genius work was done by Al-Ghazali by pointing out that metaphysics cannot be done demonstratively. Averroes tries to do something that philosophically is actually impossible.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to point that you said that Averroes has more of an influence on the Latin West than he does in Islam. And if I may ask, then, how was Al-Ghazali received in Latin, Western universities? Did he enjoy any influence or prestige with respect to his critiques of Aristotle? Because I know that certain Islamic thinkers, especially Avicenna, have an enormous impact on Latin scholasticism. But what about Al-Ghazali?
Yeah. So scholasticism is a very interesting subject, and I think much research still has to be done, because the influence on scholasticism is in the most cases indirect. So certain arguments appear, certain arguments that sometimes have their origin in Tahafut, al-falasifa. They appear actually in the Western tradition, but they're mostly read in this case as Maimonides is a conduit. Averroes is also a conduit, but Averroes Tahafut is something that in scholastic philosophy plays next to no role. It's not even the first translation of that book is actually a Renaissance translation, actually that's not true. It's 14th century that it's translated, but there is very minimal manuscript transmission of it, and then it's only in the Renaissance that such a book becomes interesting. So in the scholastic period, Latin philosophers were interested in Aristotle and anything that could illustrate to them or could enlighten them about Aristotle's texts. So Averroes is for them extremely interesting. Avicenna is interesting as well, and even Al-Farabi is interesting. But Al-Ghazali, who is a criticizer of Aristotle, is not interesting, and his critical works are not really well known. There's very few textual transmission of that. That changes very significantly in the Renaissance, when, for instance, the Tahafut is translated, printed, also widespread. 16th century, for instance, is a century when Averroes' works are available very easily through a printing press in Venice that throws out many copies of them and makes them available to many libraries and many intellectuals. And there, Averroes' Tahafut is in there. And the funny thing about the Tahafut is that it's written as a commentary. So there's a quotation of Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-falasifa with a passage from Averroes. Next, a quotation from Al-Ghazali with a passage from Averroes. And now, Al-Ghazali's views about, for instance, occasionalism become widely known. Also, again, occasionalism is something that Maimonides actually also speaks about. And now, in the 16th century, occasionalism, a view that I tried to explain earlier, becomes extremely attractive to Western thinkers, particularly of the Cartesian school. Jean Baudin, for instance, a French philosopher, very important, who's drawn towards the teachings of Al-Ghazali. So in the Renaissance, this then becomes very important. Though in scholastic philosophy, Averroes is clearly the master.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Dr. Griffel, this has been an amazing discussion and interview. Thank you so much for coming on. If I may close our discussion, what book recommendations would you have for those who'd want to learn more about Al-Ghazali or maybe, Islamic theology and philosophy in general? Did you have any recommendations?
The book itself, Tahafut al-falasifa, is actually a pretty good read, particularly if one is philosophically interested. The introductions to it are really, extremely well written and clear, and present clearly what Al-Ghazali actually wants to do. But clearly, as a first book to get acquainted with Al-Ghazali, one should read his Deliverer from Error, his autobiography. Several English translations exist, at least 3 I'm aware of, and it doesn't really matter which one chooses one. It's a really fascinating book. Other books by Al-Ghazali are equally fascinating. As I say, the incoherence of the philosophers, which exists in a bilingual edition. That's a great book to read. The smaller books of Al-Ghazali are equally interesting, and his large ethical work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, which also becomes more and more available. It consists of 40 individual books. Certain of them are also very, very interesting. For instance, also some of them deal with very profound philosophical questions. For instance, the question of predestination and fatalism. How should we react to the fact that everything is in fact predestined, as Al-Ghazali teaches? That's the 35th book of the Revival of the Religious Sciences. It's called, in the English translation, it's called On God's Unity and Trust in God. It's also a great book to read. Several others as well. The first book about knowledge, the second book about the Muslim creed. Great books. Secondary literature, I hesitate, but since I wrote it myself, I will recommend my own book, Al-Ghazali's Philosophical Theology, which first of all deals with his life in a very detailed way, and second, asks precisely the question that we ask here in this case: what about causality? And through causality, the question: what position did he in fact hold towards philosophy? That's what I'm trying to do. And then two other of my colleagues I will recommend. There's Kenneth Garden, who has a monograph, The First Renewer, it's called. And then another one which deals particular with this complex of ideas that I've mentioned, namely philosophical psychology, the teachings about the soul. There is a book by Alexander Traiger, and the precise title escapes me now, but readers might look it up. And those three books are recent works on Al-Ghazali that all give a very good analysis of his writings and his philosophy.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Griffel, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.